everyone. My name is Emily Singer Lucio. I'm the ADA coordinator for the University of Maryland.
And my name is Ron Padrón. In pronouns, I am the OACES director for the College of Information at the University of Maryland.
Great. Thanks, Ron. Welcome. We're happy to have you here today.
Excited to be here, thanks.
Yeah, I wanted to talk with you a little bit about you and your life on campus with a disability. So let's start by having you tell me a little bit about yourself, like your disability or whatever else you feel comfortable sharing.
Yeah, for sure. So as you mentioned, I identify as a disabled person. I think the one that's most salient to my sort of experiences on campus are, so I'm diagnosed with anxiety and depression, but also like about 10 years ago-ish, I developed a chronic GI illness. I also have a physical disability. I shattered my arm when I was younger, and it's held together with like metal. My elbows are reconstructed metal elbows, so I have limited sort of range of motion and mobility with my arm.
Wow, that sounds painful.
Yeah. But given the work that I do on campus, that particular disability doesn't impact my time on campus. It makes yard work and stuff like that complicated, but it doesn't.
But no one likes yard work anyway, so it doesn't matter.
But so I think the anxiety and depression definitely kind of impacts my whole life. But I think my biggest experience sort of trying to navigate campus has been learning, like developing a chronic illness about 10 years ago, and then going through the whole experience of trying to figure out what was going on, and then figuring out, what accommodations I need and kind of what best works for me for that. So I don't know, like if you want me to just dive right into that, or if you have like particular questions around it. But
well, let's start, and if there's other stuff you want to add, feel free. So I guess tell me a little bit about what it was like, learning you had a disability when you did.
Yeah, I think my first real sort of encounter with kind of being like, oh wait, I have a disability, even though the anxiety and depression was there like my whole life, but I wasn't really really diagnosed until my like mid-20s. So my early 20s is when I shattered my arm, and I had surgery to put it back together. I was doing physical therapy, and it didn't really click to me that I had done something that had sort of irreparably altered some aspect of my life or my body. And so this was in the early 2000s, so like credit card, like places still accepted cash, like it wasn't weird to pay in cash. And I was at a Subway, and I paid in cash for my sub, and they were giving me change back, and I'm right-handed. I shattered my right arm, and so I put my hand out to get the change, but I have limited pronation and supination with my hands, so it wasn't flat. And obviously the person wasn't paying attention. They were just like, okay, so the customer put their hand out, put the change in there, so they dropped the change there, but the change just went sliding right off my hand.
I could see that.
And that was my first, it's like a core memory of being like, oh wow, I really screwed up my arm pretty bad, and it's not coming back. So that kind of, was for me the first sort of like, okay, I definitely have to figure out what is life like with now having, especially being right-hand dominant, what is life like with now having a right hand, right arm that is just not fully functional anymore.
Yeah, I think it's a really good sort of point for people to pay attention to, because we talk all the time about the fact that somebody could become disabled at any point in time, right?
Yeah.
When we talk about making things accessible, we're not just talking about making them accessible for people who have disabilities in that moment. We're really talking about everybody, because any one of us could do the same thing at any point in time.
Yeah, and I think for me, when I was going through that situation, like when I shattered my arm and I was had the surgery, I was going through PT, in my mind, I was just like, oh, well, the end process of this is that everything will go back to being exactly normal. It didn't occur to me that, so I had to have a right radial head replacement was the surgery that I had. So the top third of my radius in my arm ceased to exist, and so it was replaced with a metal bolt. And I just didn't process that, clearly it's not going to go back to being normal. And at the time. I think I'd been in PT for maybe like 2 months, month or two at that point. And I remember going back to PT being like, yeah, so this just happened. I think I just finally realized, like, I have a long road of recovery to like get this back. And then my physical therapist was great and was just like, okay, but let's also have the conversation of like, realistically, you're never going to get back to 100% with your arm. So like, we're going to get as best as we can. But like, yeah, so yeah, and then as I mentioned, so like the anxiety, depression, and stuff like that. When I was diagnosed with anxiety, depression, and stuff like that, it wasn't. This was again in the early 2000s, and it wasn't really at a time where mainstream was mental health stuff was kind of like mental health stuff was separate from disability. So it wasn't necessarily the mainstream kind of talked the same way. So my relationships with sort of my mental health was not something that I also have ADHD, which was a late diagnosis. Well, yes and no. So I was diagnosed with ADHD in undergrad, but the way it was explained to me was as a learning disability. And so once I left college, I was just like, well, this doesn't impact my life anymore because I'm not in school. And then fast forward 20 years, and then being like, offhandedly mentioning that to a therapist, and they were like, wait, you have an ADHD diagnosis? And I was like, yeah, but I'm not in school. And they looked at me.
I'm so glad you said that, because I tell people that all the time. People think about learning disabilities and ADD as something that's only school related, and the reality is it's not. It's just it manifests itself in different ways at different stages of your life, right? And I talk with parents all the time about kids who are on medications. I'm like, you don't necessarily, it's not, they think, oh, I'll just take them off the medication when they're not in school. But if you really think back to like behavioral issues in the home, or other issues relating to friends, or things that in summer camps or wherever, right? Or later on when you're an adult, and how you relate to your partner or whomever, right? These things can impact you in so many different ways, in so many different stages of your life, that it's really not only a school issue, right?
Yeah, and then so I got my, I guess, re-diagnosis or confirmation, whatever, however you would refer to it, a few years ago, and it was, I tried medication. It wasn't for me. I didn't have a good experience with it. But just having the diagnosis again, and kind of like having somebody explain to me like, oh, it's not just a learning disability. It's like this is what it means, and then realizing that like, oh, okay, so like, it impacts the way that I navigate the world in a way that I would. So a lot of people, I think, don't understand that there is like a link between like ADHD and depression and anxiety. And sometimes the anxiety and depression is because you're trying to mask the ADHD. You're trying to it's kind of like trying to fit like the square peg into the round hole. And so then getting that sort of re-diagnosis like has helped me with my anxiety and depression, because I'm no longer beating myself up over like not doing things the quote unquote right way, or the way that people like have to do it. So like having a better understanding of myself, how I think, how I process, and kind of giving myself permission to kind of follow the flows of like how I best work. But the GI thing started about 10 years ago, and that was, it came out of nowhere. I really don't know what started it, what triggered it, and I think, again, kind of going back to your point, people can become disabled to any degree, really at any time. So, like, ultimately, I had this thing, like, in my genetics, like, that was just there, and I could have gone my entire life without it never kind of deciding to, like, show up, but it decided to show up in my early 30s. And it was really frustrating, because at first I thought I was just like, the first time it happened, I was just like, oh man, I think I got really bad food poisoning or something. And then it happened a few more times, and I was just like, man, like, I keep getting food poisoning. And then eventually, like, you reach a point where you're like, statistically, I'm probably not getting food poisoning this much.
Yeah.
And part of it was that the episodes and the experiences of it started cycling more frequently, and more painfully, and so then started the years long process of having to navigate sort of like doctor symptoms or my experiences. I just turned 40 a few months ago, and
happy birthday.
Thank you. And in the less than a decade leading up to me being 40, I've had 4 or 5 colonoscopies and 1 endoscopy.
Oh my gosh, I'm sorry.
To try to figure out what's going on. I also became, like, as a result of it, and like especially in the few early years of like not really getting a lot of help from like doctors or people not knowing what's going on, then on my own trying to track like what's going on with are there particular food, like what are certain things that I'm starting to notice my core like be triggers or what have you, which resulted in me becoming very, very food avoidant if I wasn't at home. And so it was a sort of cascading thing. And being nervous about like being caught out in public, and if I were to have like an episode or something like that, like what's going to happen. So it was this very sort of like ripple effect thing, where it's like suddenly this thing happened, nobody could tell me what it was triggering it, how long it was going to last. I got tested for celiacs or gluten intolerance. Like they did all the testing around the edges to see like is it Crohn's, is it whatever. So was it ulcerative colitis, like all this sort of stuff. And the answers were always like, no, it's not that, it's not that, it's not that. At one point they did some stuff to see if it was Cushing's, to see if it was something like that was stress related or cortisol related.
Wow, they really tried to rule out everything, didn't they?
Yeah, it was just no for everything. So like that was frustrating because at some point you're just like, one of these things has to be the thing.
Yeah.
And you're like, okay, well then I don't know what to do. So that's been the one that I think has been the biggest disability that impacts my experience on campus, especially because when I do have like flare-ups or episodes, it's not like it's predominantly a GI illness, but it also manifests like when I have flare-ups in like joint pain and like chronic fatigue and that sort of stuff. So it's not like, when I say flare-up, it's not like, oh, I have an upset tummy for an afternoon. It's like I'm knocked out for at least a day, maybe 2, maybe 3 days, where like just like the GI stuff, but then also like my body hurts, I'm like exhausted, the exhausted translates into sort of like brain fog or that sort of stuff. So even with accommodations to be able to work from home, like when I have a flare up, like in addition to like my telework schedule, if I need an additional work from home day because I'm in the middle of a flare or something, it still impacts my ability to like do my job because I just can't process as quickly. Like I can't process information as quickly. I'm slower to respond. I'm slower to do things.
Got it. Well, sounds like you're dealing with a lot for sure. And
we all?
Yeah. Well, yeah. Some more than others, but yes, I would do that. What have you found helpful to share about yourself with others related to your disability? Particularly since your disability is not visible.
Correct. Yeah. It's very interesting because in the first few years, it was sometimes visible because when I didn't understand where like the joint pain, especially and all that sort of stuff, was coming from, when I was, because it took me a while to kind of piece all of these things together and be like, oh, when I'm having this experience, it's also then leading to X, Y, Z. And I would say, interestingly enough, one of the people who was the most helpful was a nutritionist that I worked with a few years ago.
Yeah.
Who when I explained everything, they're like, hey, get some Pedialyte or Ensure or something like that, and next time you have an episode, start drinking that, because they clocked that some of that fatigue and joint pain was actually just related to dehydration.
Yeah. I can see that.
And that for 6 or 7 years I've been going to doctors and nobody had told me to do that.
It's amazing. Some people don't do very well at doctors. Some people do great.
But in the early part where I couldn't figure out, like, there were all of these things that did not seem related and I couldn't figure out what was going on, I actually used a cane for a couple of years. Not consistently, but like when I was having flares or what have you, I would be using a cane just because the joint pain was so bad. So in the early part of this, sometimes this was actually a visible disability because I was using a cane, which was interesting for understand that they would see me with a cane and without a cane, and there were a couple people where I tried to explain what was going on, and they just couldn't process it. So I would walk away from those conversations with them just thinking that me using a cane sometimes was just some sort of sartorial choice, and I was like, sure, fine, yeah, I'm using the cane as a fashion statement for this outfit. Okay. But for the most part, what I have found is, so I do a lot of disability research, accessibility research, and advocacy. So I have grown to become very comfortable talking about my disabilities, and specifically the GI disability because, it's kind of just generally labeled like IBS. That's kind of what they put it as. We're like, we don't know what it is, but this is the stamp we're going to give it.
And for people who don't know, IBS is irritable bowel syndrome.
Oh yeah, and and those are sorts of things that in our culture, you don't necessarily want to talk about things that make you have to go to the bathroom. So a lot of it for me is just sort of just like having become more comfortable talking about it, to kind of destigmatize it, because there are lots of folks who actually kind of have, disabilities that relate to bodily functions that you don't necessarily talk about in polite society. And
I think we have to get over that sometimes.
Yeah, and especially because then if you're, I remember early on, I would, if I was somewhere and there were foods, like now I know that there are certain food triggers and stuff like that. Like there are certain things that I can't eat that through going to the doctors and through doing testing and stuff like that. They're just like, yeah, these are things that will trigger you. Now I know, like if I'm RSVPing for something or what have you, and they have that field of just like, do you have any food allergies or restrictions? Now I know like what to write down to make sure that there's something I can eat. But in the early years, I didn't know, so I just wouldn't eat. And it was awkward to be like, I'm at a conference or I'm at like a workshop and there's like working lunch or something, and people are like, oh, aren't you hungry? Aren't you gonna eat? And being like, no. And not wanting to explain to people like I don't want to eat because I don't know if something's going to like make me have to like leave the room in a hurry.
Yeah.
And
have you gotten to a point where you like have a list of foods you know are going to impact you more so than others at all?
Yeah, so now I know that like what's safe for me mostly is like as long as there's like a vegetarian option, right? Like so for me it's like red meats, fried things, like really fatty stuff, like those trigger me. But so I know now that if there's an event and they have a list of like are there any food restrictions or allergies or what have you, that as long as there's vegetarian options, I'm fine.
And that's a great reminder. Sorry to interrupt you. That's a great reminder that we try and share again all the time, right? When people are planning events on campus, on their registration forms, to not only include a statement about ADA accommodations, but if they're serving food, to also put in there if there's food sensitivity or food dietary restrictions of any sort, to indicate that, right? So that we're being welcoming and accessible to everybody.
Mm-hmm. Because it's not just a preference. It's just like, well, I don't really like chicken. Like, I'd rather you had seafood. Like, for some folks, it's, I can't eat this. Like, I am highly allergic to X. And I joke with people because, when people ask me if I'm a vegetarian, I'll be like, I'm primarily vegetarian, but not by choice. So,
well, that must be hard to explain sometimes, too, right? Because it's not necessarily that you're vegetarian, because vegetarians, again, primarily are vegetarian by choice, right? Not always, but a lot of the time, right? And so, saying you're vegetarian is not really the whole story, right?
Right.
So, it must be challenging.
But a lot of it is like I've just become much more comfortable in sort of being honest and talking about. And I will say, when I talk about my disability, I'm talking just about my experiences. So I'm not trying to like generalize, and I make sure that if people want to have a conversation with me, let them know. Yeah, I will talk to you about what it's like for me to navigate this. And part of why I do that is just sort of to kind of help destigmatize destigmatize just talking about disability in general, but also, to just, model for people what it's like to be able to, so that people can develop the confidence and be able to advocate for themselves and say, actually, hey, I actually have this need, or I have this, what have you. There's a person on campus. I'm not gonna name them, but when I mentioned to them that I did get accommodations for my, my IBS and all that sort of stuff, they're like, I didn't know that you could get accommodations for that, and I was just like, yeah, it's a recognized disability. And so they went through the process to do that, and they're like, yeah, like I did it, and it's been great because, they were same like a lot of the same thing where they had become really food avoidance, or like would eat on campus, or things like that, because they didn't want to be in a situation where they were in a meeting, and had to, leave. So yeah, some of it for me is just, I've become more comfortable talking about my various disabilities, just to kind of help destigmatize them, and less destigmatize them for non-disabled communities, so that way they are, better understand our experiences, but more destigmatize it for disabled people to become more comfortable saying, like, hi, I need to ask for X accommodation, and this is sort of, why. Not that disabled people should ever be put in a position where they have to, like, justify and give out personal details or personal information, but even just saying that you have a disability, or if you go through an accommodations process, a lot of times, like for the legal accommodations process, you too have to disclose what the disability is, even though not everybody's going to see it. The folks in HR, the folks, whatever, some people are going to see it, but just destigmatizing that sort of shame or embarrassment or whatever around disclosing that you have a disability and saying, hey, I need accommodations for XYZ.
Yeah, I'm really impressed by your outspokenness about it. It's great, and that leads to a question about, what do you wish other people knew or understood about you that you think they don't necessarily?
Well, and that's a really broad question.
Yeah. Yeah, in terms of a disability, so like when you share with them about, these things, and I'm assuming that you sort of, on some occasions you share more detail, on other occasions you share less detail, and I'm sure when on the occasions where you share less detail, sometimes people walk away maybe with more questions than answers, but it's just because, you chose for whatever reason not to share more. And so I guess in those situations, what do you wish people would sort of understand about the situation with you?
Yeah, so sometimes, like, I'll just tell people that I have a chronic illness, and I won't kind of dive deep into it. I think when it comes to especially sort of chronic illnesses that develop later in life, from my own experience, something that I think people, and I try to remember now as somebody who, like, supervises folks as, and stuff like that, is, like, it's not, when you are diagnosed with a chronic illness, there is a period of time in which, first off, you don't, very rarely do you go, you're living your life, you go to the doctor, you're just like, oh, I have my physicals today, and then while you're at the physical, they hand you a card that says, like, oh, did you know you have this chronic illness now? And it gives you all the information. So when it comes to sort of a chronic illness or something that manifests later in life, there's a period of time where you have no idea what's going on with your body. And then you might seek sort of medical help, medical intervention, or diagnosis. That again is a period of time where now not only do you not know what's going on with your body, now you and a bunch of other people also don't know what's going on with your body. And then you're working towards sort of figuring out what's going on, getting a diagnosis, or if not getting a diagnosis, figuring out how to navigate it. So when people talk about, like, getting accommodations, I think people kind of wave this idea of getting accommodations as sort of like a magic wand, where it's like, okay, but there's a process, and for some people it's short. It might be a couple of weeks or a couple of months. In my case, it was a few years of trying to actually figure out what's going on. Like, I don't know what accommodations. Like, in the beginning of my journey with this chronic illness, I didn't, like, if I went to HR or somebody to ask for accommodations, I wouldn't know what accommodations I needed, because I was still trying to figure out what was going on. And just because I didn't know what accommodations I needed doesn't mean that, one, I didn't need
Mm-hmm.
Or if it's a temporary disability, they think, like, oh, it's because you got into some sort of accident, car accident, sports accident, whatever, and so you have a broken leg, you have a TBI, like something that you're like, oh, we know how to manage this in the short term. But when you, especially as an adult, are used to living your life a certain way, and then now something is developing that changes that, there's a learning curve. And in that learning curve, a lot of people kind of fall into this gap where things aren't how they used to be, but things are in a place where they know what to ask for or qualify necessarily for accommodations, but they still need support in that space.
Yeah. Yeah. What would you say some of your biggest challenges have been, and how have you worked through them?
I think some of my biggest challenges have been, even with the mental health stuff, sort of early on in my career. So I've been working in higher ed for about 20 years. Early on in my career with anxiety and depression and stuff, there was a lot of navigating the stigmas around that. So I think a lot of the challenges have just been navigating stigma or shame or embarrassment around sort of disability, or being really afraid of letting people know that, I have anxiety or depression or chronic illness, like that I have these disabilities that require accommodations or, what have you. And so, like, overcoming that sort of stigma or shame about it, I think, was a big challenge. Not just personally, like so much of it was also sort of like socially fed. And one of the things that I really appreciate about sort of younger generations is how much more open they are about mental health.
Mm-hmm.
So I think, that's great to see where folks are less afraid to say, hey, I have anxiety or I have depression, or even if you're not diagnosed, as being like, hey, I'm actually going through something right now that is just really difficult for me to manage, and I just need some space or I need some grace for that. That was a challenge for me because that wasn't how society was when I was growing up.
Yeah, it's changed a lot.
Yeah. And then I think personally, I am kind of a workaholic, and I come from a family of folks who are always on the front lines of doing stuff.
Mm-hmm.
My dad was a paramedic, my grandfather was a nurse, so like my dad had every opportunity to like sit for a lieutenant's exam or something and kind of move up the ranks, but he wanted to be like a firefighter paramedic, like that's what he was. So I'm used to I come from a family that's used to being, in the trenches doing the work. And then navigating what it's like for me to have reduced capacity, like not the same sort of capacity that I had previous to the chronic illness. That has been a struggle of just having to relearn or recalibrate, like, okay, what's my ceiling? How far can I push myself? And then actually like convincing myself to like respect and honor that and not continually push myself past that into like burnout.
Must be hard to do sometimes.
Yeah. And I think especially for disabled folks, when we feel pressured to either personally pressured or organizationally pressured, socially pressured to keep up with our non-disabled peers, to prove that we can be just as productive or valuable as them. I think sometimes, like unlearning that is a real challenge, and it's not linear. Like sometimes you slip back into that.
Yeah.
I feel like I got pretty good at it in one job, and then when I was, promoted into a leadership position, I fell back into that because now I was in a leadership position. I feel like I had to like really, really perform and definitely push myself too far. I've only taken FML once in my career, and it was after I had gotten promoted to a leadership position, and I pushed myself too far trying to I don't know, I thought it seemed like somehow I thought that being like, okay, now that I've been promoted, somehow I'm not disabled anymore, I can do all of this stuff now, and then I went way past burnout. I had to take like a month of FML.
Wow. Well, thanks for sharing that. Are there any final thoughts you want to share?
I just I think that I don't know. Like, I mean, there's at the time of this recording, it's just a crazy world.
Yeah, yeah.
And so I think everybody is trying their best. And I think, I think folks, I just want folks to be sort of conscious about sort of the spaces that they're creating and curating, to make sure that they are spaces where folks feel like they can ask for the help or the supports that they need, in a way that they're not going to be judged. We don't know what people are navigating on campus, what their situations are, family situation, like the ripple effects of all the things that are going on. And so, that's going to impact people differently, and making sure that we leave space for people to say, hey, I'm struggling right now, and I need some extra time, or I need some help with this, or what have you, accommodations. Yes, there's legal accommodations, but then there's also just accommodations that we can give by just being good people.
It's a great note to end on. Thank you so much, Ron, for joining us today. I do hope this conversation opens people's eyes to what it is like to live with a disability. For more information about resources at University of Maryland about disability, please go to our accessibility website at accessibility.umd.edu. Thanks everyone for listening, and thanks again, Ron, for coming today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.